And welcome back to Stories from the River. We are in the midst of our World Business Forum New York City recap. I'm sitting here today with Will Luke, our Director of Retail Operations, and our head coach, Stacey McCormick, our Senior Vice President of Retail Performance. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today.
It's great to be back.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome to Stories from the River, a show in which we go behind the scenes at Broad River Retail.
So let's get right in. So Simon Sinek, this was a headline speaker that we were really all looking forward to. I should maybe introduce Simon for those who don't know. He wrote the best-selling books, Start With Why, Leaders Eat Last. His latest book was The Infinite Game, which we've either read or listened to, and I know we all enjoy, really about James Carson's theory and writings, and continued that. And he also runs the popular podcast, A Bit of Optimism. And this is a guy who's super optimistic. He started a company called the Optimism Company. So it was a little bit different though. So sometimes these speakers, they'll talk about their latest book, their current writings, or maybe an accumulation of like all of their writings. You know, they've got maybe a prepared speech or some points they want to land. You know, that's kind of what I was expecting with Simon. Like, what's he got next? It wasn't like that though, was it?
It wasn't, but you know, I kind of loved it, right? I mean, you see so many of these speakers come on stage and you hear them talk and you think, well, this is the same speech I've heard them give before, the same speech I've seen online. So I think it takes an incredible amount of authenticity to go up there, take questions cold and answer them. And I think one more thing I'll say about this, if I could be indulgent, that I've never seen any speaker do before, is when somebody asked the question on the app, he would ask where they were in the room, kind of located where they were, and he addressed his answer directly to that person who asked it. And I thought that showed just an incredible amount of authenticity. I've never seen any other speaker do that before.
Yeah. So, Stacey, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think what Will said was right on point. I was kind of a little disappointed that he didn't have some kind of prepared like speech or talk, because I'm a huge fan. So just be able to get those tidbits. However, I did like what Will talked about, is that it was authentic and it was in the moment and it wasn't something that he had prepared. So it was coming from his true feelings. And I did like the fact that he personally addressed everyone who asked. He personally addressed you when you asked your question, and Manny. So it was great. But the other thing that I would say was this: is the only reason I may not have enjoyed that was the fact that a lot of the questions had kind of recency bias in them, because they would say, hey, Marcus Collins said this, so what do you think about that? Or whatever. It wasn't really, it might not have been the question that they would have asked had they not listened to all the other speakers before him.
It made for a little bit of a disjointed presentation as well, where kind of the topics were skipping around, so it was hard to kind of track. There wasn't kind of a unified theme. So as I look at my notes, there's so many kind of sound bites that are all kind of things to think on, but they don't necessarily run together. Yeah.
So Simon didn't have a prepared talk. I think that's a fair feedback. I was probably a little bit disappointed with you as well, Stacey, because once we were getting into it, I'm like, wait, what's going on here? He's not actually doing a speech or presentation. So, but once we got into it, okay, well, let me hear what he's got to say. There were, to your point, Will, a lot of great nuggets, and I've got, several pages of notes here, and we'll go through some of those and the takeaways. And it was interesting. It was authentic. I mean, Simon was wearing 2 watches.
First thing I have written on my list.
Yeah. So there's an Awobi app, and you can submit questions. So once about midway through, I figured out what was going on. I started submitting a lot of questions. He read one of mine. He picked my 3rd one I had submitted. So to get a 4th one that I thought he might have a chance, I put it under your name, Will.
I thought you weren't doing like Charles, Chuck, Charlie.
Yeah, no, the 4th one I put it under Will Luke. But I think I should have put it under like Heather Greenwood or Kim Harkness, maybe, or Lynn Knowles. Maybe they would have gone, with a little bit more gender diversification there. However, then Manny got one of his questions asked, which I thought was really cool. So we'll get into that. So it was all going into the app, submitting your questions, and then Chris would read it to Simon. He'd identify, hey, where are you? He saw most of the people were on the right side of the audience, and then he'd address that question. Several questions were, why are you wearing 2 watches? His point of view was he wears the Apple Watch on his right wrist because he thinks that's the best fitness tracker, and he doesn't use it for anything else other than to track his fitness, he had a lot going on his wrist, a lot of jewelry. I think the Whoop tracker's just good enough. So anyways, but Will, give me some of your big takeaways from the key themes that you heard.
I think I'd build on that first. And you talked about some of his books. If you haven't seen, I don't think it's a TED Talk, but it's a podcast or some sort of recorded speech that Simon gives. And I think it's called The Millennial Question. And he talks more about his perception of kind of the dangers of technology. So I think his answer for the 2 watches again showed that he kind of practiced what he preached, that he didn't want to be connected. He had the Apple Watch, but he only used it for the biometrics piece of it. And I thought that was really interesting. Someone of his status that's actually, he's not just throwing these theories out into the world, he's living them. So, right off the bat, I thought that was super interesting. A couple sound bites, and I know we can probably go deeper on a few of these. You always get the behavior that you reward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a big one. So he kind of gave that story on the heels of telling the story about Noah, which I think he writes about in this book, The Infinite Game, and the barista from the Four Seasons, and his managers were always checking in. Do you need some help? What more can we do for you? And so he loved his job. And so the whole point from my notes and what I recall him saying is, don't just reward outputs, reward the behaviors, and you'll, if you want to reward initiative, you'll get more initiative. Someone will take more initiative. So I thought that that was a great takeaway. So Stacey, to you, what were some of your key themes, key takeaways from Simon's Q&A?
I think that he talked about great leaders being great students of leadership, that to take yourself on as one of the people that you're going to mentor. In other words, that self, we heard that a lot, right? Like, who was it that said, you need to, I think it was Jenny Rometty that said that you have to be an Olympic learner, right? So it's right down that same path. One of the things that I really liked was the hackathon. And, Will likes this too, I'm pretty sure, but it's about getting your best and brightest and creating teams and having them take your biggest problems and try to solve them. And we learned about that from Synchrony at our visit at their offices the day before. They have a group and they call it a hackathon, and they take their best and brightest technical minds and the people in that space of innovation, and they have teams around the country that come together and try to solve or come up with the biggest ideas. So I thought that was really cool. I think it's this speaking about momentum, and he talks about when you're playing to win the finite game as a business, what ends up happening is it starts to produce a loss of trust because you're not always going to win, and there's an end to it. It saps people of productivity because it becomes more about you're not creating urgency to go do a great job. You're creating really more kind of anxiety around trying to win this moment, like this time right now. And I think there's a healthy balance there, but I also believe that leads into, loss of goodwill or gaining goodwill, depending on how you go about it. And then are you creating people that can, through your leadership, are you creating people that can, that can and will, or are you creating people that can and either don't or won't? Mm-hmm. And I think that really is a great challenge to our leadership.
Well, I think those are two great points. On the hackathon, I mean, I think about like running the experiment, which we heard at the Purpose Summit. And I think about
Rick Sheridan.
Rick Sheridan, Chief Joy Officer.
Yep.
I think about like our issues, like let's just take a smaller problem, like despised inventory. Right, let's go get in a room and hack away at it.
It's a big problem.
It's a big, relatively, it's in the midst of all of our problems, but it's one we need to solve, and it's complex, and it takes multiple inputs and consideration. So it's something we can apply, like what Stacey's talking about at Synchrony, the Innovation Lab, and
I think that weaves into kind of the work from home conversation that he hinted at too, because it's sometimes harder to collaborate and kind of foster that environment where you have time to kind of let your ideas roam and chase down kind of silly ideas, and you have all the players at the table, right? So we can look at conversations like despised inventory, and I might have a really strong point of view, and Stacey may have a really strong point of view, But if we don't have every kind of department and every kind of place that is impacted in the room, then we might be missing out on the best solution.
I think what you're maybe alluding to is the opportunity for spontaneous water cooler brainstorming amongst collaborators or various departments is more challenged because you have to schedule it, and it's better done in person.
Yeah.
And if you're like, well, this is my day in the week in the office, this is my day, and like, oh, okay, then 6 weeks, 8 weeks have passed,
and sometimes if it's contrived, you don't get there. Yeah. And maybe that's what he's going at with the hackathon, right? I mean, Synchrony, they talked about having like a very defined structure for their hackathon. I mean, kind of the way that they go about doing it, the way they ask the question, the way they foster kind of the different thoughts. So I think it's something that you can manufacture, but that obviously takes a lot of kind of time and energy to put something like that together.
Lanny, I like that, Will. And I think the other thing is how many times have I had a brilliant idea or an idea that might be brilliant? I don't know. Maybe it's not, but I was going to ask the person that I needed to ask about it. But by the time I got around to them being in front of me, I lost it.
Yeah.
I mean, how many great ideas kind of go by the wayside just like that?
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to go into your second point, Stacey, in your opening comments, which is about the finite infinite game and the momentum. And Marshall Goldsmith also talked about like self-mastery. Several of them did. You mentioned Jenny Rometty and the Olympic learner and working on yourself. And the goal is to perpetuate the game and play with an infinite mindset and being a leader who plays with an infinite mindset which leads to what you want, which is not a decline of trust, culture, morale, but a purpose-driven with a sense of patience, and you're perpetuating the game, and you got a long-term mindset. But let's go in, since Will already kind of opened the kimono. Let's go straight there to this big topic of work from home, work from the office. So, in the spirit of Q&A, I think this was like my third question I had submitted, and it's one that Chris picked up and read. And it was about the Surgeon General has described the epidemic of loneliness now as like the country's biggest epidemic. And I simply asked the question to Simon: is this is it in any way related? Is it caused by the work from home, or is it correlated by the work from home? The isolation and the loneliness. And Simon didn't mince words or an opinion. He didn't say, well, it's correlated. He said, oh, no questions asked. It's causation. It's causation all the way. And so his whole point is, without kind of really mincing like a point of view, he took the stand like, we got to get people back in the office. We got to be back together in person, which some people might say, well, that's a really antiquated, old school point of view. The world's changed. And then someone said, well, how do you deal with like introverts or people who like it's more flexible? And he said, reframe coming to work as an act of service to the introverts. Like, hey, you're doing it for the team, the good of the team. And so what was your takeaway with how he like answered that work from home question? Well, I tell you what, while you're pondering that, Will, Stacey, I'll start with you.
For me, I never stopped working at the office. I mean, even when I think there's a lot of days, and it was probably just me and Edie were there and Jesse down at the desk. But I always went to the office or went to the stores. I need that interaction. I thrive on it. So for me, and I also need that separation kind of church and state for myself there, from home to work, and be able to shift gears. Not that I'm not productive, but I feel like I'm more productive when I'm at work, when I'm at the office. However, I also know that, in today's world with the connectivity that we have and everything else, that there's a lot of times when people can be highly productive at home, or they may be even more productive at home. What I see is the loss of connection. And for me, I believe in my beliefs that we're built for connection. We're built to be together. We're built to spend time with each other. We're built to lift each other up, listen to each other, and their stories and things of that nature. So I just think when you strip out that level of human connection and connectivity, I think you lose something. And I believe that is part of the causation. I would agree that I've got people that I know in my life that look, from pets to humans, that I saw a difference in how they interact, act, and behave in social settings and pulling themselves purposefully out of more social settings than they did ever before since COVID and since the isolation.
It's interesting to note, I've heard, and I can't substantiate this, just what I've heard, that therapists and school systems are talking about how more kids are struggling at school now than they ever have. And a lot of them think that that's kind of the ripple effect of kind of that 2 years of isolation, which was kind of a blip on their social development, right? And now they're having a hard time acclimatizing back to a highly social environment.
Well, I think it's a complex topic. He took a strong point of view on it, which I don't mind someone taking a strong point of view and backing it up with what he thinks from a sociological standpoint. I mean, that's kind of his background. And I think to your point, hey, we're built for connection. Now, how can you layer in the advantages of a flexible, hybrid work environment? Does it have to be 5 days a week, bell to bell, like it used to be? How do you accommodate, the single mom or the single parent who eliminated a 2-hour daily commute and can be just as productive? So I don't know, but it's not available to all people, right? Healthcare workers, they largely have to go into the hospital or the medical office. Our operations folks, they've got to go into the distribution center. Our retail memory makers have to go into a store. They don't really have the luxury of working from home. However, our contact center memory makers, by and large, can work from home, and we can kind of track every phone call and work productivity. And a lot of times that's what they desire. And so how do you kind of build culture and solve this? I think though that generally speaking, we need to allow for coming to work. And I think that point of as an act of service, as an act of connection, as an act of relationship, and allowing for those spontaneous combustion type hackathons or brainstorming opportunities.
So a question for you, Charlie. I'd say if you could rewind the clock to before COVID, what would your outlook have been on like customer care being a work at home? Would you have predicted that it would have worked as well as it's seemingly working right now?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, that was a big surprise. I'd never contemplated if our technology would even allow for that or how that would work. I mean, no, I mean, my mindset was very much in that box. Everyone needs to be here where we can see it. You come to work and, but I did it to a fault. I mean, now I blurred the lines a lot. Like I've always worked from the office, from home, but that's, as an entrepreneur, I think I've probably overworked and worked too many hours and worked 7 days a week and worked, I don't count the number of hours, but it was, to the detriment of like, not having enough boundaries at home or being, and sometimes you have to do that. You feel like you have to do that. So I don't know that I'm a good case study personally. So I'd never even pondered, could they work from home and do it successly? That was a big surprise that we got from COVID.
And obviously asked that because I agree as well. And that, that challenges your thinking about what other traditional models that we're really used to and we think are they don't need changing. What are we missing? How high is the ceiling?
The other thing though, Will, I would say is the data is still pretty early. Like even though we might think it feels good or we can be as productive, and what are we losing out on human connection? And was the world ready to make that seismic shift? And what else are people getting into if they don't have the right disciplines? When we did one of the interactions, and we were going to kind of meet other people. I think Marshall Goldsmith ran this, and they said, go meet someone random and give them a problem to solve. And his problem to solve was, how can I like monitor my screen time? That was his issue. And so, when people are working from home and they're not going into an office, what other bad habits are they picking up or things and what is long-term being done to like, if you get more convenient, just kind of get into your Groundhog Day syndrome because that feels good in the moment and you think it's more convenient, but are there long-term issues there? And the data is probably still too early. And so I do think probably we should look at swinging the pendulum back but allowing flexibility to a point. So I don't know how we solve for that, but I think there's probably more truth than not in what Simon's point of view on that.
No, and I totally agree with that. And it's highly nuanced, but ultimately with us, solving problems, collaborating, one of our core values, that really does best happen either organically or when you're in the same room with that kind of expressed purpose. So I think looking for ways to make that easier, whether it be people in the office all on the same day or having workspaces that are kind of catalyze that conversation, is the direction that we should be thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about this things. Will, you mentioned it earlier about the incentives and rewarding the right behaviors. How do we think about that in our business? Like Stacey, we reward outputs a lot, right? There's bonuses and tied to outputs. You're in the retail performance, not the retail behavior business. Although you've implemented a lot of behaviors, but are you tying the rewards? Do you feel like we reward initiative as well as we should, or are we still rewarding outputs? How did you internalize that point of view that he gave?
I mean, obviously, if you look at our system, it does reward output and end result. And however, what we try to do a really, really good job of, and I feel like we do a really good job of, and I think we're going to get even better as we go, and that is showing people that the behavior is what causes the result. Mm-hmm. There's a causation there of the behavior does right. If you do the right behaviors, then your results are going to come, and then this is going to be your reward. However, I think as an organization too, one of the things we do is we do a great job of catching people doing things right. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I think that is the behavioral reward. Now, could we do better? Always. But is our radar up in real time, catching someone doing just a basically correct thing, and we're saying great job.
Yeah, and we have a whole program around that.
Exactly. We do, but we should have that at the ground level at the store in P2I as an organization, or for our managers in P2I in the warehouse.
You're using an acronym for our audience. What is P2I?
Sorry. Position to impact.
Yeah, which means your head's on a swivel, you're in the game, you're in the store, you're right there when something happens, and you can right away, hey, great job, I saw what you did there. On
we're engaged, highly engaged with both our internal and external guests, and same thing would happen. So, but I do believe that our reward, I think we could find a way though, and what we probably don't reward enough is initiative. And that really struck me, and it's something I have highlighted here because it says reward initiatives, not outcome, incentivized behaviors, not outcomes, but the initiative. It takes me back to I was a management trainee with a guy named Walter Knopf in Mobile, Alabama, Rhodes Furniture, 1992. Okay. And I made a decision that ended up being the wrong decision. Basically, I ended up making a decision that ended up, the guy delivered a mattress because we were in a mattress contest. And basically what happens is the guy's driving this dual wheel granny low type stick shift, burns the person's clutch up because it was another employee's truck that I authorized him to go do it on. And we ended up having to pay to have a new clutch put in this vehicle, and it cost over $1,000. And I made the decision. I'm the one that told him to do it. And what Walter did was he called me in and he asked me about everything. And he told me that I probably made the wrong decision, but he rewarded me and praised me for having enough initiative to make the decision. Yeah. And he said, that right there, young man, I was 21 years old. That's going to be why you're going to be wildly successful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that we do enough rewarding initiative and recognizing initiative.
And not being afraid of a consequence.
That's it.
Well, and I think if we do more of this, we're teaching the customer beliefs and what we believe about our customers and about our organizational purpose, and just make sure you protect that, then the initiative should follow that. And then just reinforcing that by rewarding the initiative. So how do you respond to his quote that the only time you should be asked to leave a company is if someone's uncoachable? Like in terms of, just find a different role for them, don't find someone. I mean, that's a pretty absolute position. The only time you should fire someone is if they're uncoachable.
It's a tough one. I mean, it certainly is in line with his philosophy of idealism and kind of optimism. Mm-hmm. So I can see why he would think that. And I think I like it in an environment that has a really structured, frequent coaching mechanism. I think the fear is if that doesn't exist, then someone who is someone who's maybe having a negative effect on the team or not contributing, that can grow and have a big impact if it's not addressed. And, you know, what I've seen in previous lives is sometimes when you make that recognition that that person isn't pulling on the same end of the rope, it can take a long time to deal with that. And I think there is some sort of an organizational impact, and there's some sort of there's a cultural impact. So maybe I have a little bit more of a cynical view. I certainly believe that everyone has potential if they receive the right coaching, clarity, right? I've seen Stacey impact so many people that maybe someone else would have written off, right? If you give that person clarity and you give that person positive feedback, you can unlock that. But I think there's a point where you have to draw the line.
Well, he definitely takes an absolute statement, and I think it's easy to kind of poke some holes in an absolute. I'm
purely speculating.
Yeah, I
actually
don't think it's. I don't think it's being cynical. I think it's practical or pragmatic. You know, he's just saying being coachable is the number one core value. Well, there could be other things. What if your skills just aren't equipped and you're a really small company, and if they can't do the skills, you got to tell them to move on. I mean, there could be what if they just can't show up for work and they're just not tardy and they don't get there on time, or you know, there could be other reasons to part ways that you can find holes in an absolute statement. But I do appreciate his idealism. He's consistent with his
people
idealism.
Not showing up to work is also kind of being uncoachable. So I tend to probably agree primarily with it, except for in the things where somebody, don't lie, cheat, or steal type stuff, right? Or don't fight or cuss or, get,
well, those would be examples.
Get after somebody those are absolutes. But the by and large, I mean, I think we have if we're going to say that we're going to catch people doing things right, and that we're going to have that type of, and we're going to incentivize initiatives and behavior, then we have to lean into somebody's willingness to want to do a good job, which I believe everybody wants to do.
Yeah. So he talked about David Markey, the submarine driver, Rick Elias, who survived Miracle on the Hudson, who owns and CEO of Red Ventures.
Yep.
Yeah, here in Charlotte, and Teddy, he's got a great podcast as well. 3 Things with Rick Elias. He talked about Teddy Roosevelt. Comparison is the thief of joy. So any of those topics that you guys want to dig into? Otherwise, and he also he got some questions on AI and optimism, which I thought was a great topic.
I think I'd actually jump us back if that's okay. I mean, I've been in my head just thinking about the correlation between the behavior you reward and the infinite game, right? And thinking about if you're only getting the result, is that sustainable? Is it teachable? But to win the infinite game, you have to have a really replicatable system, and that system is more based on the behaviors than it is on the results. So I think there's some correlation there, and it makes me think a little bit about 40X, right? The lead measure versus the lag measure. So if anything, I think it's a really good kind of filter or challenge question that we need to ask ourselves, not to be cynical or not to try and break things apart, but kind of look at some of our I know I'm certainly doing it for my team and looking at some of the reward systems that we have and ensuring that it is getting us a long-term win, not just a short-term win. And then it's also sustainable and replicatable.
That's great.
I agree. I think part of the challenge that we have is some of the behaviors that are going to get us the biggest results are not trackable at 100%. And so that's the other thing to me on bonus or incentives or rewards is that it has to be something that you can attach to that's got a very good measuring system that can be counted on. Yeah. It's not me checking my own paper or turning, and it can't, in other words, it can't be pencil whipped or beat.
Right.
And so I think that there's a balance that we have to strike in that of, okay, I would love to incentivize the behaviors versus the ultimate result. Because I believe the results will be phenomenal. Mm-hmm. The problem is that finding a way to measure them at a high level with a high degree of accuracy becomes a little bit of a challenge.
Got an idea. Hackathon.
There we go. Let's go. But the one thing I would like to talk about and is the one thing that he really didn't get to much, but he started out with how many companies are making their decisions based on their purpose statement. Mm. And this idea in the infinite game of just cause. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the most powerful things that he talks about, because if I'm doing, what's your why? Like he talks about start with why, but if I'm doing something that I know I'm doing for someone else or for a bigger or a greater good, then I'm more likely to do it than I am if I'm just doing it for my own personal gain. And that's probably the biggest thing that I can take from the infinite game is that identifying what your just cause is, having a cause that is really just, and it's not paraded around, at, virtue signaling or anything like that, that it's really what you're about. And so what's your thoughts there?
He said, if you don't advance your purpose, it's just marketing. And then he also said, is your company making decisions based on a purpose statement, right?
Yeah.
So first you have to have a clearly defined purpose statement, which we do. And then when you have that now becomes kind of a filter or a measuring stick for all of your decisions.
Yeah. I mean, I think that could be an episode in and of itself. That's a big topic.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's a big part of the intro of the Infinite Game book. And yeah, you're right. He didn't get super into that. But it's an important one to kind of rest on and reflect on. And okay, so to close this out here, he talked about change starts at home, idealism. I want to get to the question he answered of Manny's. Someone asked him about the original gospel of Start With Why. He talked about his journey to discover his why was huge, and it came after a dark season of his. He's still an absolute devotee to the original gospel. And then he talked about AI and optimism and why he's still optimistic and why he thinks that it's a parallel to the internet. People were fearful of the internet, but the jobs changed, but they're still created jobs. And he gave the example of the editor versus the writer.
Yep.
In the AI world, the editor becomes a hero, AI becomes the writer. They switch. But he said the speed of AI is scary and needs to be kind of monitored because the internet took decades and AI has come about in like a year. And we still have laws from like 1986 governing some of these things. So he said that part was a little bit scary. So on those last three topics, and I'll get to we'll close out with the idealism. Do you want to start talk about any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say AI is both terrifying and exciting. So sometimes it can be overwhelming not knowing necessarily where to start. But when you think about the future of work and even some of those complex problems that we can solve, we don't know what we don't know about what we can solve.
That's it. I mean, hey, maybe that becomes the hackathon, right? So for me, I would agree with Will. I think it's both terrifying and exciting. And being the elder statesman of the group here, it's probably a little bit more intimidating for me just to know where to start. So what I've done is I've signed up for it and I've started, and we'll see. I'll do more studying and see if I can figure it out. But just the things that you can put at your fingertips in a few seconds versus things that would take you weeks of research to do. But I'm a little afraid of that too, because isn't there some value to you doing the research yourself and not having it all just served up to you? So I'm excited about it. I feel like it's got value, but I'm also wondering if it does. I could remember every phone number of every person that was in my circle and in my life, hundreds of phone numbers. Now I can't remember one. So is it going to do that to us? Is it going to dumb us down?
In some ways, maybe yes, but in some ways there may be more exponential insights and learning. I think his point is optimistic, but we need to bring the guardrails along with it.
Regulation.
We need to think about governance, guardrails. And I think that's probably even the battle that OpenAI had with their board and with Sam Altman and how they got rid of them. They brought them back and they're because they were a nonprofit that started a for-profit company, and they're trying to think about, well, how do we make it a net positive for humanity? I actually think the fact that these conversations are taking place are a net positive in terms of let's do AI the right way, in the healthy way, and not like it's gonna change fast. We need to make sure we don't obliterate jobs along the way. We need to create new jobs and make sure we have good governance and protections. Like social media probably came up too fast without the right guardrails, and they're learning a whole lot about that right now. And because they let them grade their own papers and monitor them and what they did to teen suicide rates or teen mental health or some of the images that they showed, all these stats that are coming out now, and that's not what this episode's about, but I think to do it better in the right way, which is the right guardrails and governance, along with the technology, which means we might have to go a little bit slower, but let's do it the right way for an infinite mindset, not a finite mindset. Which leads us to the last question, which he picked up Manny's question. And Manny, as we were wrestling through what is our company's word of the year going to be, he said, "Hey, Simon, what's your word of the year? Any word of the year for 2024?" Which I thought was a great question that Chris read. And Simon said, "Well, I don't do words of the year, but I do like a New Year's theme." And of course, the guy who has a company called the Optimism Company, he said his theme is idealism. And so how did he unpack idealism, Will?
I think just in line with how he thinks. It's seeing the best in people. It's approaching challenges with positivity. I didn't get a lot of notes on that. I don't know if you did.
I wrote down what he said, and he said basically this: what does a perfect world look like? What should it look like? And start moving towards that, is what he said. So identify what a perfect world would look like for you or for your organization or for your family, and then just start taking the steps towards moving that way.
Yeah, and look, thousands of leaders were in that room, and he said change starts at home. He made this bold comment, because he's a idealistic thinker, which I really appreciate, right? Not getting jaded. And he said the possibility for world peace literally exists in this room alone.
Love that.
So the possibility for world peace literally exists in this room alone. And so that is probably, in essence, what Simon Sinek's all about, is a purely optimistic mindset, an infinite mindset, and an idealistic mindset. So that's all we got for you today. Thank you, Will and Stacey, for joining me on this recap episode of World Business Forum New York City 2023, the Simon Sinek episode. So we're in the midst of this series, so check back next time for the next speaker who we recap. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for listening to Stories from the River. To check out more episodes, visit storiesfromtheriver.com. Join us again next week, and remember to like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast.